Hello, and welcome back to our continuing lesson in the story of God, a study that we started almost 2 years ago now in Sunday school. And we're continuing in our discussion about the afterlife, heaven and hell, and what happens to people after we die. And 2 weeks ago, we started a little mini series on what's called the intermediate state. What happens to people between the time they die and the end of the age when we all experience bodily resurrection? And as I shared 2 weeks ago, this part of the study has been very difficult for me to prepare, in part because the subject is so personal. We all have loved ones who have passed away, and we care deeply about what they are experiencing now, if in fact they are experiencing anything at this point in time. The other thing that makes this study difficult for me is the fact that the Bible isn't as clear as I would like it to be. In fact, as I have studied more and more over the last couple of weeks, another thing that I've realized is that at the end of the day, what we believe about the intermediate state really isn't all that important. Nobody is going to burn in hell forever because they believe the wrong thing about the intermediate state. And if the Bible writers didn't see fit to fully explain it with the level of detail that I think that I would like to see, then perhaps this is a subject that isn't truly all that important biblically, and I think that's the case. Biblically, the focus is on bodily resurrection. Biblically, the focus is not on what happens to us after we die and before we're raised from the dead. And yet, I'm studying this. And one of the reasons I'm studying this is because I think that this subject matter illustrates the extent to which modern day Christianity has in fact been influenced by Platonic philosophy and the Gnosticism of the first century that so much of the New Testament was written to combat against. And let me illustrate that. Here I've got a comparison of how the Old Testament Hebrews and the Platonic Gnostic philosophers of the first century viewed both the nature of humanity and death. And it was very different. On the Old Testament Hebrew side, they did not see the body and soul as two separate entities. Rather, they saw body and soul as a united entity that they called nephesh. And that nephesh was simply a living, breathing creature. And that word nephesh, that is translated soul in the Old Testament, applied to both humans and animals. So there was a unity of body and soul. The body and the soul lived together and they died together. When they died, both body and soul died. And it's probably not even correct to talk about body and soul in this context, because for the ancient Hebrews, there was just a one living organism that died. Under the ancient Hebrew view of things, death was an enemy that needed to be defeated. And it was defeated by bodily resurrection in those wonderful passages in Hosea and in Daniel and Ezekiel, where we see bodily resurrection being taught and preached. That was the defeat of death. And that was the remedy for death, and death was an enemy. This was completely different from the Platonic philosophy that grew up around the 4th, 5th century BC and was extended through the Gnostic beliefs of the first century. When the Christian church was being developed, Greek philosophers sort of combined Christianity with Plato's philosophy and came up with this Gnostic dualism. And in this philosophy, the body and the soul are separate entities. The body dies and the soul lives on. And this is known as dualism. In the Platonic world, death is a friend. It's a friend in the sense that the soul, which is superior to the body, is released from the prison of the body. The body rots in the ground and the soul lives on in the disembodied heaven. Now, as we shared a couple weeks ago, in modern day Christianity, about 2/3 of professing Christians say that they do not believe in a bodily resurrection. Instead, they are clinging to a belief that's very much like what you see on the right column here, Platonic Gnosticism. They believe in a disembodied soul, that when you die, your disembodied soul goes straight to heaven or hell. And that's the end of things. And that is a very, very common belief in 21st century Christianity. And it's unfortunate because those who hold to that belief are missing out on the richness of the goodness of the gospel of the New Testament and the Old Testament. So, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, there are basically three different beliefs about the intermediate state. I've got these kind of ordered differently than I did 2 weeks ago, but in the first belief, there's essentially no consciousness. This follows the beliefs of the Hebrews in the Old Testament, where one sleeps in death, awaiting bodily resurrection. There's no consciousness, there's no activity, nothing is happening. As Martin Luther put it, you die and then you wake up in the resurrection. And that the time between the two may be thousands of years, but you don't experience that time period. You don't experience anything. You just simply die and then you wake up in resurrection. And that was, again, the belief of Martin Luther, and others have held different beliefs, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second belief is the one that I just mentioned, which follows the Platonic Gnostic view of things, that when you die, you face immediate judgment, and then your soul goes to either heaven or hell while your body rots in the ground. Of the three beliefs, this is the one that is probably most demonstrably unbiblical, and yet it's probably the one that's most believed amongst Christians worldwide. Again, 66%, 2/3 of Christians generally do not believe in bodily resurrection, either Jesus' literal physical bodily resurrection or our own at the end of the age. And so a majority of people who call themselves Christians fall within this second belief system, and yet it's probably the most unbiblical. The third belief system is a little bit more nuanced, and there's a lot of different takes on it, but this is also very prevalent in Christianity, and this is sort of what I'm going to call a blending of the Hebrew belief in resurrection and the Platonic Gnostic belief in an immortal soul. This third belief believes that when we die, our soul or our spirit, whatever you want to call it, has a conscious existence in some temporary state. And depending on your status, that temporary state may be paradise, Sheol, or Hades, or if you're a Roman Catholic, that temporary state could be purgatory. There's a lot of detail and nuances in all of this. Obviously, there are many people who believe in a temporary conscious state who don't accept the idea of purgatory. That's not my point at this point in time of the lesson. Here, all I want the point to make is that there are those who believe that when the body dies, something about us, some consciousness about us survives that death and enters into a temporary state. At the end of the age, that something called a soul or a spirit will be reunited to our body, and then it's all resurrected into the final state. So in the third belief, we have a belief in some sort of immortal part of our existence, called the soul, if you wish, and the resurrection of the body. So it's a blending of Platonic Gnostic philosophy and Old Testament Hebrew beliefs. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about how different people in different camps believe various things along these lines. Today, what I want to do is let's look at the scriptures and see what we can find in the scriptures. And as I've shared before, the frustrating thing is the scriptures aren't as clear as I would like them to be, nor are they as consistent as I would like them to be. And I just want to demonstrate that a little bit here, and as we go along. So the Old Testament metaphor for death was sleep. You see this over and over again. In 1 Kings 2:10, we see David slept with his fathers and was buried in David's city. And throughout the Old Testament, you see this phrase repeated 36 times. So-and-so slept with his fathers. It's always referring to one of the kings. As you go through 1 Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you'll see this being repeated over and over again. So-and-so slept with his fathers. So-and-so slept with his fathers. And that was the metaphor that was used. It was called sleep. When people slept with their fathers, they went to Sheol. And Sheol wasn't necessarily a place per se, but rather an existence of unconscious inactivity. Nothing is happening in Sheol. We see this in Psalm 6:5. It says, "For in death there is no memory of you. In Sheol, who shall give you thanks?" A dead person in Sheol has no memory because nothing's happening. The person is dead, and they're in Sheol, and nothing is happening. There's no memory. Solomon brings this out more in Ecclesiastes 9:10. "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work, nor plan, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in Sheol where you are going." So he puts it even more completely, that there's no work, there's no plan, there's no knowledge, there's no wisdom. In Psalms, there's no memory. Nothing is happening in Sheol. It is, as some writers put it, it's a shadowy existence at best. It's unconscious, it's inactive, it is, sleep is the metaphor that is used. So there's this sense of you're existing in Sheol. There's no sense of the passage of time. You're just waiting there in death, which is the enemy, and you're waiting until the bodily resurrection. But you're not aware of anything. You're not aware that you're waiting for bodily resurrection. You're just there. This metaphor for sleep is carried over into the New Testament. We see Paul uses this phraseology repeatedly. He says, in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the resurrection chapter, he talks about, then Jesus appeared to over 500 brothers at once, most of whom remain until now, but some have also fallen asleep, referring to the fact that they have died. In 1 Corinthians 15:20, but now Christ has been raised from the dead. He has become the first fruit of those who are asleep. Again, those who have died. And then in verse 51, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed. That's a reflection of Paul's belief at that time, perhaps, that Jesus would be coming even within his own lifetime. So some of them would not all sleep, but they would all be changed. Again, the metaphor used for death there is sleep. And there's nothing in these verses, at least, that indicate that the person who has fallen asleep is experiencing anything. But let's go on, because that's not the rest of the story. Another passage about sleep, 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4. But we don't want you to be ignorant, brothers, concerning those who have fallen asleep, so that you don't grieve like the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we tell you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will in no way precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with God's trumpet. The dead in Christ will rise first. So here, Paul is comparing or setting falling asleep apart with rising, resurrection, bodily resurrection. And again, he's given the impression that those who have died are just simply in a state of sleep. They have fallen asleep. Many people argue that this is just simply a euphemism for saying that they've died without necessarily commenting on what their current state is, and that may be the case. But he is suggesting in this passage that without the promise of resurrection, those who have fallen asleep have no hope. He says that up in verse 13. We don't want you to grieve like the rest who have no hope. Well, the people who have no hope are the people who don't believe in resurrection. In other words, the implication is that whatever the state is for the person who has died, it is not one that would make you want to set aside the hope of resurrection. In other words, in the Platonic world, the Platonic Gnostic world, the Platonic philosophers didn't want a bodily resurrection. They were very happy to know that their body was rotting in the ground, but their soul was in heaven. Now, if my soul is in heaven, then I don't need the hope of resurrection. And this is one of the reasons why I am focusing a little bit on this topic. I'm very much concerned that if we have too much of a Gnostic view of what happens to our souls after we die, we can lose sight of the need for resurrection. And this is what William Tyndale was trying to say in response to Sir Thomas More back in the 1500s. Sir Thomas More was one of those who believed in a very glorious intermediate state where the soul is in the presence of God and we're glorious, we're happy, and that's the end of that, while we wait for resurrection. And Tyndale said, well, gee whiz, Sir Thomas More, if that's the way you believe about death, then why do we even need to bother with resurrection? You're happy, you're with God, you're in his presence in a disembodied heaven. Why bother coming back to a new body? And this has been one of the reasons for some of the debates along these lines. There are those who are very much concerned that by clinging to a disembodied temporary intermediate state in the presence of God, we place our hope in that state rather than in the fact that we are going to rise at the end of the age. And Paul here is bringing the hope back where it belongs. The dead, he says, have fallen asleep. Their hope is not for what the state is at this point in time. Their hope is for the resurrection that will happen at the end of the age. Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, liked to say that what happens to human beings after we die should be patterned after what happened to Jesus when he died. And so this is where the scriptures get very interesting, because we have some different things being expressed. We have Jesus on the cross talking with the thief. And this is a famous passage. I've read this in a lot of people's writings talking about the intermediate state. And Luke 23, Jesus is talking to the thief. The thief says, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And there are many scholars who say, there it is right there. Jesus is saying that as soon as I die, my soul is going to go to paradise and you're going to be with me in paradise. That seems to end the question. Except there are other passages that say different things about what Jesus experienced between death and resurrection. We have the passage in 1 Peter chapter 3. Because Christ also suffered for sins once, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he also went and preached to the spirits in prison. Now, this is a very cloudy passage. It's been difficult to interpret. A lot of different thoughts about it. But one of the prevailing thoughts about this passage is that the idea that Jesus, between the time of his death and his resurrection, his soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, went into Hades to preach to the spirits in prison. It goes on to talk about those who were disobedient at the time of Noah. And there's a whole doctrine that has built up around this passage, the doctrine known as the harrowing of hell, the idea that between the death and resurrection of Jesus, he went into Hades or hell, preached to the spirits in prison, and essentially emptied hell. This is a not uncommon belief. And yet, if that's what's happening between death and resurrection for Jesus, can we say that he was in paradise on the day that he died? I guess you can always say, well, Jesus is spiritual and omnipresent, so he can be in paradise and Hades at the same time. I'm not going to argue necessarily against that, but that sort of seems to put an end to all discussion about pretty much anything in the Bible. And so that's not necessarily a satisfactory explanation for me, at least. It may be for you, that's fine. I think there's more to it than that. We have another passage, though, to muddy things up even a little bit more. I mean, here we've got, in these two passages, we have Jesus either being in paradise with God between death and resurrection, or Jesus is in Hades or in prison, preaching to the spirits in prison. And then we have Peter again, this is reported in Acts. Peter is giving his sermon on the day of Pentecost. And he's talking about Jesus being raised up. He says, whom God raised up, having freed him from the agony of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. So what's going on here? Now, the Greek word here for agony is like pains, birth pains. It's often used in labor, the notion that this is a pain that produces something better, something good, labor pains resulting in a birth. Here, the pains of death resulted in Jesus' resurrection. But this is a totally different concept from Jesus being with the thief in paradise that day, or Jesus being in Hades, preaching to the spirits in prison at that time. The agony of death. Why did Peter use that turn of phrase in Acts chapter 2? And I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer. This is an illustration of what I was trying to say earlier, that the Bible, I don't believe, is as clear and consistent as I would like it to be on these questions as to what happened to Jesus between death and resurrection and what happens to the rest of us between death and resurrection. It just isn't as clear as I would like it to be. And the reason I think it's not as clear is because that was never the purpose of the Bible. It was never the focus of the Bible to talk about what happens to people between death and resurrection. That wasn't the focus. It's become important to us because we live in a time where there is now hundreds and thousands of years between death and the end of the age. When most of the New Testament was written, the people writing it were expecting the end of the age to come very soon. Well, we're 2,000 years down the road, and all the apostles have now been in a state of death for 2,000 years. What, if anything, are they experiencing right now? And so that's why it's important to us, more important to us than it was to them when they were writing these passages. So let's muddy the waters even further a little bit. Let me go back. Jesus and the thief, talking about the passage in Luke. One way that we may be able to reconcile some of this is realizing the grammar of first century Greek. Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." When this was written, there were no quotation marks, there were no commas, there were no periods, there were no breaks in sentences, there was nothing. And if I could illustrate what this would have looked like in the original Greek using English letters and English words, but you can get the idea. This is what it would have looked like. Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It's almost unreadable. It's one reason why in the first century, if you read something, you almost always read it aloud so that you could vocalize it and figure out where the word breaks were. Well, when the translators were translating this and putting it into English and scribes copying it in the later centuries, they started adding punctuation and they put a comma in there. "Assuredly, I tell you, comma, today you will be with me in paradise." That comma was not in the original Greek. And it's quite possible to put the comma somewhere else. "Assuredly, I tell you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise." By putting the comma after the word today, now the word today modifies "assuredly, I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." And there are many scholars who say that's what Jesus meant there. He wasn't saying that today, on Good Friday, AD 33, you and I are going to be in paradise together. He was saying, no, on Good Friday, 33 AD, I am telling you that you will be with me in paradise, but that being together in paradise will happen at the end of the age after the bodily resurrection. So there are scholars that go both ways on this. This, if that is the case, then this can be more easily reconciled with 2 Peter and Acts 2, which give a different picture of what happened to Jesus between the cross and the resurrection. Different thoughts. Let's look at another well-known passage. "To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord." This is in 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8. "Therefore, we are always confident and know that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are courageous, I say, and are willing rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord." This sounds very much like, okay, my body dies. Whatever the true me is, I am now absent from the body and therefore at home with the Lord. I'm in the presence of God. Like the thief, I'm with God in paradise, and that very well may be what Paul is talking about. N.T. Wright takes that view, and it's kind of interesting that he takes that view because he's a very firm opponent of the notion of an immortal soul. He writes very strongly about the idea that we do not have a Platonic immortal soul. Rather, we are this body-soul unity. And yet, N.T. Wright does believe that when Paul writes this, and when he also writes in Philippians that for him to live as Christ and to die as gain, he is talking about some sort of a soulish spiritual consciousness that survives death. And so that when our body dies, something about us, some consciousness, and Wright doesn't necessarily put a label on it, some consciousness exists in the presence of God. Presumably being aware of the passage of time or whatever, but there's some sort of consciousness in the presence of God while the person awaits final resurrection. A. Richard Middleton takes a different approach, and this is interesting because in most situations, Wright and Middleton are in lockstep with each other. But Middleton here believes and has written that he believes that Wright may have, quote, conceded too much. He believes that Paul is not talking here about a soulish existence with God, but rather he is looking forward to bodily resurrection. And he gets this by looking at the larger context of 1 Corinthians 5. He goes back to verse 1. Now let's look at this context. "For we know that if the earthly house of our tent is dissolved," he's talking about our current mortal body, We have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Talking about our resurrection body. For most certainly in this we groan, longing to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed, we will not be found naked. For indeed, we who are in this tent do groan, being burdened, not that we desire to be unclothed, but that we desire to be clothed, that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now, he who made us for this very thing is God, who also gave us the down payment of the Spirit. Therefore, we are always confident and know that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. So this verse 6 is part of a larger context here. And what Middleton is saying is, if you look at this context, Paul is talking about being clothed in our immortal resurrection body. We don't want to be naked. To be naked would be to have a disembodied soul like the Platonic Gnostics were talking about. And keep in mind who Paul's audience here was. His audience were Christians in Corinth. Corinth was a hotbed of Platonic philosophy. It was all over the place. So you've got people in Corinth who presumably are talking about disembodied existence, the soul being released from the body and going off to heaven. And Paul's saying, no, that is being naked. That is being unclothed. We want to be clothed in a body. And he's talking very strongly here about resurrection. So when he talks about being absent from this body to be present with the Lord, according to Middleton, what he is saying is he wants, when we are absent from our present body, the next thing we will experience is bodily resurrection. And then we will be in the presence of the Lord in the bodily resurrection. Again, splitting hairs, I know, but the idea here, and the reason Middleton is splitting these hairs, he's very much concerned about the extent to which Platonic philosophy and Gnosticism has crept into Christianity. And that's the concern. And he's very much concerned, I'm sure, with the fact that 2/3 of Christians don't even believe in a bodily resurrection. That's something to be concerned about. But at the end of the day, probably the best quote I've seen on this is from Middleton himself. He says, in the end, however, it doesn't matter. Authentic Christian hope does not depend on an intermediate state. Neither do Christians need the Platonic notion of an immortal soul in order to guarantee personal continuity between present earthly existence and future resurrection life. The core of Christianity, the thing that binds us together as Christians, is our belief in bodily resurrection. And this is central to Christianity. What happens in the intermediate state simply is not that important. We know this, that when we die, we're in God's hands. Whether we are sleeping, whether we are actively doing things, whether we are in just a state of suspended animation or whatever until the resurrection, none of that matters. We know that we are in the presence of, we know that we are in God's hands, let me put it that way. We know that we are in God's hands, that he has our life in his hands, and we know that the day will come when we will be raised from the dead. I have no concern that my grandparents behind me are in some sort of state of agony, and they are experiencing agony for the next, hundreds of years until the end of the age. That's not a concern of mine. I know that they are in the hands of God, that he is taking care of them. Whatever state they are in God's hands, because he is sovereign and he is love, and that's enough for me. So just keep in mind, again, the purpose of this study isn't necessarily to promote or not promote any given view of the intermediate state, but let's be aware of where some of our thoughts and beliefs may come from. Do they come from the Bible, or has our reading of the Bible been influenced by Platonic philosophy? And that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And I'm always looking at that as I read the Bible myself. How much am I reading the Bible with my Platonic sunglasses on? And all too often I find that it's there much more than I want it to be. That's the point of this study. All right, come back next week. We'll continue our discussion about heaven and hell. And with that, God bless you all. Have a wonderful weekend.